already we have some farmers that are saying these floods are taking place and they're washing away my crops because of climate change. They're blaming what?
Climate change.
Don't be so quick to blame climate change.
Going back to the question that I had asked about climate change and global warming.
The two are often used interchangeably. Okay? People will talk about global warming as if they are talking about climate change, and climate change as if they're talking about global warming. Now, it's okay to use the two terms interchangeably if you know what you mean. But the problem is you begin to confuse people that do not know what the difference is between the two terms. Mostly I'm interested in kids, okay?
Yes.
If we confuse them with they don't know what the difference is between global warming and climate change, then there's that confusion. How do you fight an enemy you can't define, you can't explain? In order for you to defeat an enemy, you need to know who the enemy is. So it's important for us to know what global warming is and what climate change is. So I'll use a basic example. Imagine we went back to grade 8, and we were in class, and the geography teacher walks in. Then the geography teacher says, asks a question. He's very specific, he's a teacher. So he says, okay, so I'm going to ask for a definition from you, KHODWANI. KHODWANI, what is climate change? Then you answer, you say, climate change, sir, is global warming. What do we expect the teacher to say? Should the teacher say, KHODWANI, you are correct, 2 marks? The correct reaction from the teacher will be, no, KHODWANI, climate change is not global warming. I did not ask you for an example of climate change. I asked you for the definition of climate change. So what is the definition of climate change? The definition of climate change is the change in the average climatic conditions of the atmosphere in a region over a long period of time. The change in the average climatic conditions of a region, a very large place, over a long period of time. The time is very specific. It has to be a long period of time. If we go back to geography in high school, the minimum number of years for it to qualify as climate is 35 years. You see that, huh?
Yes.
So now that we've defined climate change, the question is, what is global warming? Global warming is the increase in the average temperatures of the atmosphere or climatic systems in an area over a long period of time. So you will notice that when we talk about global warming, it's with reference to duration and region or area, but it specifically refers to one component of climate, which is temperature. So if we go back and try and define climate now, you will notice when we talk about climate, we can't talk about climate without talking about weather. So what is weather? Weather refers to the prevailing atmospheric conditions at any particular moment, okay, in a particular place. What are these atmospheric conditions? We are talking about rainfall. We are talking about air pressure. We're talking about temperature. We're talking about humidity. We're talking about wind direction. We're talking about wind speed. We're talking about cloud cover. We're talking about visibility, haze, mist, and fog. Those are the components of weather. Notice temperature is just one of the 8 components of weather. And weather is about an instant moment. We would look outside right now and talk about the weather. But if we're going to talk about the climate, it will be the prevailing atmospheric conditions of a region over a long period of time, which should be a minimum of 35 years. So when you say global warming is climate change, we have to go back to the 8 components of weather. A change in any of those 8 I've mentioned qualifies to be an example of climate change. So global warming is just one example of climate change. Of course, people refer to it as if it's climate change because it's one of the most pressing examples. But it is not climate change. It's an example of climate change. Changes in rainfall pattern are also an example of climate change. The component we're looking at is rainfall. If it changes over a long period of time, then it's also an example of climate change. But notice, you don't hear people say, well, the changes in rainfall are climate change. Because for some reason they understand that rainfall is just a component of weather and climate. But global warming, for some reason, equals climate change. It's not looked at as a component of weather and climate. So that's how I would try and relate the two, the difference between global warming and climate change. I feel it's important that we understand that difference, because if you understand what you're dealing with, it's very easy to adapt to it. So we talk about climate change adaptation. It's very easy to prevent it. It's very easy to mitigate it. If you don't know what you're talking about, it's impossible to develop tools and methods to try and solve that particular enemy. In this case, the enemy being climate change.
I think one thing that stood out when you were describing both is over a long period of time, which means that this is something that we could have counted, would have actually made a better turn of events. Yes, and over the years, I think climate change is not a new phenomenon.
No, it's not.
It's something that we have heard of. Even as we were growing up, though we didn't exactly know what it meant. Even you mentioned geography, and that's a very good thing, because when we were in high school, we were taught this, but then, it just went over our heads. Now, this is the same thing with farmers. There's some harmful practices that they have been, practicing. Yeah?
Yeah.
And then in the end, it has contributed. It's just not the regular person, it's also the farmer. What are these farming practices that are responsible for, making our atmosphere less than it's supposed to be, for lack of a better term?
Okay. When we talk about farming, like you mentioned, there are different practices that farmers have. You've got practices that are adopted by commercial farmers, and you've got practices that are adopted by subsistence farmers. But you notice, I'll give examples of practices. When a person in Lusaka is doing fine, the first thing they want to do is get an asset, a farm. You will notice what a lot of people do the moment they get a farm is immediately start cutting down they literally clear the whole place.
Yes.
Are you planning to plant crops, or you're planning to set up a football pitch? And you're scared, you might be bumping into stumps or something. If you care about farming the right way, farming in a way that respects the environment, you will not chop up every piece of tree. You need to understand that you need the trees to help with your cultivation. What's the importance of leaving the trees? I'll give you an example of what's happening right now with the flash floods we're having. Already we have some farmers that are saying these floods are taking place and they're washing away my crops because of climate change. They're blaming what?
Climate change.
Don't be so quick to blame climate change.